The crowd roared in a cacophony of alien voices as another body hit the dust of the galactic arena. The towering Ectory champion stood victorious, his forearms raised high, blood dripping from his claws. His most recent opponent, a human, lay broken at his feet, motionless. In the stands, spectators jeered, their laughter echoing through the massive coliseum. Humans, they mocked, were not made for this. They were weak, fragile, and far too soft for the brutal combat that the arena demanded. But one figure remained still, unaffected by the insults. Leonus, a human from a line long thought extinct, waited in the shadows beneath the grandstand. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing calm, as he watched the carnage unfold. Unlike the others, he had no intention of being humiliated here. His ancestors, the Spartans, had faced worse odds. Their blood flowed in his veins, and their unyielding spirit had not died with them. The herald's voice cut through the din. "Next challenger, Leonus of Earth!" The crowd's laughter swelled again as Leonus stepped into the light. He moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on the Ectory waiting for him in the center of the ring. His armor, a blend of ancient Spartan design and modern human technology, clanked softly as he crossed the arena floor. In his hand he gripped a spear, its blade honed to a deadly point. On his back, a shield bore the symbol of his people, the lambda, a mark of defiance and strength. From across the arena, the Ectory champion sneered. "Another human to crush!" The alien growled, his voice a guttural rumble. He flexed his arms, readying himself for what he believed would be an easy victory. Leonus said nothing. Words were useless here. Only action mattered. The signal to begin echoed through the arena, and the Ectory charged, his massive form barreling forward like a freight train. Dust kicked up in his wake, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. Leonus stood his ground, watching, waiting. The crowd screamed for blood, eager to see the human fall. At the last possible moment, Leonus moved. His body twisted, just enough to avoid the Ectory's first strike. The alien's claws tore through the air where he had been standing only seconds before. With lightning reflexes, Leonus countered, driving his spear toward the exposed side of the Ectory's torso. The blade struck true, sinking deep into the alien's flesh. The crowd fell silent. For the first time, a human had drawn blood. The Ectory howled in pain, but his fury only fueled his aggression. He swung his massive arms in wild arcs, hoping to catch Leonus off guard. But Leonus was faster, more disciplined. Every move was calculated, every strike deliberate. The Spartan training that had been passed down to him was etched into his very bones. He fought not with the desperation of a man seeking survival, but with the precision of a warrior who knew victory was already his. Blow after blow, Leonus whittled the Ectory down. His spear slashed at tendons, his shield deflected the alien's frenzied attacks. The fight, which had seemed so certain in the eyes of the crowd, had turned into a brutal lesson in humility for the champion. "You fight like a cornered animal," Leonus finally spoke, his voice steady, controlled. "But even the fiercest beast can be broken." The Ectory roared in defiance, launching himself at Leonus in a desperate attempt to overpower him with sheer strength. But strength alone was not enough. Leonus stepped aside with practiced ease, raising his spear high before driving it down into the alien's spine. The Ectory collapsed, his body twitching as the spear's energy blade severed his nerves. For a moment, the arena was silent, save for the Ectory's labored breathing. Then, slowly, the crowd erupted. It wasn't laughter this time. It wasn't mockery. It was awe. Leonus stood over his fallen opponent, pulling his spear free with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked up, his gaze scanning the thousands of faces now watching him with a mix of disbelief and respect. He had done what they thought impossible. He had not only survived, he had won. His heart still beat steadily, though adrenaline coursed through his veins. There would be more battles, more champions to face. This was only the beginning. But in this moment, standing amidst the dust and blood of the arena floor, Leonus knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had earned the right to be here. As he turned to leave the arena, his eyes flickered toward the next set of challengers waiting in the shadows. They watched him closely, no longer filled with derision but with a newfound wariness. The humans had not come to be slaughtered. They had come to conquer. With each step, the crowd's chant grew louder, a single word reverberating through the vast expanse of the arena. Leonus! 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 He allowed himself the smallest of smiles as he disappeared into the tunnels beneath the arena. The galaxy had learned something today. Humans were far from soft. And they were far from finished. The corridor beneath the arena was dimly lit, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and sweat. Leonus moved in silence, his steps steady despite the fatigue settling into his muscles. The adrenaline from the fight was fading, replaced by a familiar, cold clarity. He had won the first round, but the path ahead was far from over. His grip tightened on the spear as the distant echoes of the crowd's chants still reverberated in his ears. A sharp hiss broke the silence. Ahead of him, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and slender, draped in the silken robes of the arena's overseers. The alien's violet eyes gleamed in the low light, sizing Leonus up as if he were nothing more than prey. "You've surprised them," the overseer said, voice smooth and calculating. "But do not mistake one victory for dominance, human. There are others waiting who will relish in your defeat." Leonus' expression didn't change. He had nothing to prove to this alien, no desire to engage in meaningless posturing. Instead, he walked past, the cold steel of his spear reflecting the overseer's piercing gaze. "Your next opponent won't be so predictable," the overseer called after him. "Be ready." Leonus kept moving, his mind already shifting to the next fight. The overseer's words barely registered. He had fought many battles in his life, most of them on Earth, and this arena, despite its grandeur, was no different. Victory wasn't earned through arrogance. It was forged through preparation, discipline, and the willingness to outlast every opponent, no matter the odds. As he entered the gladiator's preparation room, Leonus allowed himself a brief moment to assess the damage. His armor bore deep gashes, the once smooth surface now marred by the claws of his fallen enemy. His body, though bruised, was unbroken. He had come through worse. He sat down on the bench, the heavy weight of exhaustion momentarily settling into his limbs. His hand drifted to his side, where a deep cut throbbed beneath the armor. Pain, he reminded himself, was nothing more than a distraction. The door slid open, and a small figure slipped inside, quiet as a whisper. A human, a woman, her sharp eyes gleaming with a mix of admiration and caution. She was one of the arena's medics, sent to tend to the fighters after each battle. "You'll need this," she said, kneeling beside him, pulling a small syringe from her pack. "That cuts deep. Won't be good if you bleed out in the next round." Leonus grunted his acknowledgement, pulling his armor aside to reveal the wound. The woman worked quickly, her hands steady as she applied the healing salve and sealed the wound. He studied her face as she worked, noting the determination there. Everyone here, human or otherwise, had something to prove. "Who's next?" he asked, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, surprised he hadn't already been told. "The Threxian. She's fast, agile, and fights with venom-tipped blades. Nobody's survived more than 2 minutes with her." Leonus nodded, absorbing the information. He had watched the Threxian fight before, her movements like a blur of death in the arena. This fight would be different from the last. Brute strength wasn't her weapon, speed and precision were. But Leonus wasn't unprepared. Every opponent had a weakness, and he would find hers. "Thanks," he muttered as the medic finished patching him up and stood to leave. "Don't die," she replied, a small smile playing at the edge of her lips. "You're the first hope we've had in a while." Leonus didn't respond. He wasn't here to inspire hope. He was here to win. The doors to the arena opened once more, the roar of the crowd greeting him like a tidal wave. This time, there was no laughter. The spectators had seen him fight, and though they still didn't believe he could win, they now watched with something closer to curiosity than derision. Across the arena floor, the Threxian awaited. She stood tall, her thin, sinewy body coiled like a serpent, ready to strike. In each hand she held a blade, their edges glinting with the venom that had claimed so many before him. Her eyes locked onto Leonus, predatory and cold. The signal sounded, and she was moving before the dust had even settled. Leonus barely had time to raise his shield before her first blade slashed through the air, missing his face by inches. She was fast, faster than anything he fought before. Her movements were erratic, impossible to predict, but he didn't need to predict them. He only needed to survive long enough to find the pattern. Her strikes came in a whirlwind, each one closer than the last. His shield absorbed most of the blows, but a few grazed his armor, and he could feel the venom's heat as it sizzled against the metal. The crowd was on edge, sensing that this fight would not be as one-sided as the last. Leonus waited, biding his time, letting her attacks tire her out. Her speed was her greatest asset, but also her greatest vulnerability. Speed required energy, and no one, human or alien, could keep up that pace forever. The moment came when her rhythm faltered, just for an instant. It was all Leonus needed. He pivoted, his spear slicing through the air with deadly precision. The tip grazed her shoulder, drawing blood, but more importantly, forcing her back. The crowd gasped, the first signs of doubt creeping into their cheers. The Thraxian hissed, her eyes narrowing in fury. She lunged again, but this time, Leonus was ready. He sidestepped, driving his shield into her chest with enough force to send her sprawling. Before she could recover, his spear was at her throat. For a moment, everything went still. The Thraxian stared up at him, her body tense, but she knew, as did the crowd, this fight was over. With a swift motion, Leonus withdrew his spear and turned, leaving her to scramble to her feet, humiliated but alive. The arena was silent as he walked off the battlefield. He didn't need the crowd's cheers or their approval. Victory was enough. As the doors closed behind him, sealing him once again in the shadows, Leonus allowed himself a single thought: one more down, many more to go. The metallic door slid shut behind Leonus, sealing off the roar of the arena. The momentary silence was disorienting, his breath loud in his ears as the adrenaline began to fade. His muscles burned, a dull ache settling deep into his bones. The Thraxian had been a challenge, her speed pushing him to the edge. But she was down. Victory was his again. Still, there was no satisfaction, only a sense of grim focus. The next fight would come soon, and it would be even harder. A voice echoed through the corridor, low and sharp. "They're starting to take you seriously now." Leonus turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a tall, humanoid creature with pale, luminescent skin and elongated features. The alien's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, their gaze calculating, almost predatory. It was an arena handler, one of those responsible for managing the gladiators between battles. Leonus had seen him before, always lurking, always watching. "I'm not here for their approval," Leonus said, his voice rough from exertion. "I'm here to win." The handler chuckled, a strange sound that didn't quite match his appearance. "Win? Yes, you've been doing that. But you must know this can't last. You're an outsider, human. You may be strong, but they will break you, eventually." Leonus met the handler's gaze, unwavering. "They'll try." The alien studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the resolve behind those words. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped aside, allowing Leonus to pass. Inside the preparation chamber, Leonus sat down heavily on the cold stone bench. His armor was battered, the once sleek surface now covered in scratches and dents from the last two fights. He'd need to repair it soon, but there was no time now. His next opponent would be waiting, and he had to be ready. The door opened again, and the medic from before slipped in, moving quickly to his side. "You keep surprising them," she said as she inspected the damage. "The longer you last, the more nervous they get." "They should be," Leonus replied, wincing slightly as she applied another healing salve to a deep cut on his forearm. "Word is, your next fight won't be like the others," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They're sending in someone different." Leonus raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" She hesitated for a moment, then met his gaze. He's not just another warrior. He's a warlord. His name's Koresh. He's fought in over 100 battles and hasn't lost a single one. Leonus absorbed this in silence. The name was unfamiliar to him, but it didn't matter. Every opponent in this arena was dangerous, and the ones with reputations were often the most vulnerable. They relied on their fearsome names to do half the work. Leonus knew better. He had faced fear. He had lived with it, trained with it, and conquered it. "Let him come," Leonus said, his voice steady. "I'll face him like the rest." The medic gave a tight nod, but her eyes betrayed her concern. She finished her work quickly, then stepped back. "You're stronger than they think. Just be careful." Without another word, she left, the door closing softly behind her. Leonus stood and flexed his arm, testing the salve's effectiveness. The pain had dulled, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Koresh was coming, and this fight would be different. He could feel it. The crowd wasn't just waiting for a spectacle anymore, they were waiting for a reckoning. The door to the arena slid open once more, and the roar of the crowd rushed in like a wave, deafening in its intensity. Leonus stepped out into the light, the heat of the arena floor immediately oppressive. Across the sand, the towering figure of Koresh waited. The warlord was massive, his dark armor gleaming under the harsh light, a hulking symbol of raw power. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Leonus with an unsettling calm. For the first time, the crowd didn't jeer. They were silent, anticipating the clash of titans. Leonus could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. This wasn't just another fight. This was a test, a battle that would decide whether he truly belonged here, or whether he would finally fall like the others. Koresh stepped forward, his voice booming across the arena. "You've done well, human. But this is where it ends. You're strong, but strength alone doesn't win wars." Leonus readied his spear, the weight familiar in his hands. "Neither does arrogance." The signal sounded, and Koresh moved faster than Leonus had anticipated. The warlord's first strike was a brutal downward slash, aimed to cleave Leonus in two. Leonus barely had time to raise his shield, the force of the blow sending shockwaves through his arm. He gritted his teeth and pushed back, using the momentum to spin out of the way. Koresh pressed the attack, his movements precise, relentless. Each strike was calculated, designed to wear Leonus down, to break his defenses piece by piece. Leonus was forced to retreat, blocking blow after blow, each impact jarring his bones. But even as Koresh advanced, Leonus could see it, the tiniest hesitation between each strike, the calculated gaps in his rhythm. He was waiting for Leonus to make a mistake. But Leonus had no intention of giving him one. As Koresh swung again, Leonus ducked low, sweeping his spear at the warlord's legs. The blow connected, and Koresh stumbled, just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Leonus surged forward, driving his spear toward the exposed gap in Koresh's armor. The crowd gasped as the spear struck true, embedding deep into the warlord's side. Koresh roared, but he wasn't down yet. With a savage swing, he knocked Leonus back, ripping the spear from his side and tossing it aside. Blood poured from the wound, but Koresh stood tall, fury burning in his eyes. "You're good," Koresh growled. "But not good enough." Leonus rose to his feet, breathing hard, his shield arm throbbing. "We'll see." The two warriors faced each other again, the air between them crackling with tension. The crowd was on edge, no longer sure of the outcome. And as the next round began, Leonus knew one thing with certainty: this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Koresh towered over Leonus, blood dripping from the wound in his side, yet his stance was still steady, his gaze unyielding. The warlord's breathing was harsh, but it was the fury in his eyes that burned brightest. The crowd held its breath, their excitement tempered by uncertainty. Leonus stood across from Koresh, his body aching, muscles burning, but his mind was sharp. This fight wasn't just about strength or skill anymore, it had become a battle of wills, a contest to see who could endure the longest. The arena was silent now, the roar of the spectators reduced to a low murmur, as if they, too, understood the gravity of this moment. Leonus wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing as he studied Koresh's movements. The warlord might have size and raw power, but every fighter had a breaking point. Koresh spoke first, his voice a low growl. "You think a single strike can stop me, human? I've seen stronger warriors than you crumble under my fist." Leonus didn't respond, his focus on the subtle shifts in Koresh's posture. The warlord was hurt, but still dangerous. Each step Koresh took was slower, more deliberate, and Leonus knew his time was running out. If he didn't act soon, Koresh's endurance would outlast him. The warlord lunged, his massive fist swinging toward Leonus in a brutal arc. Leonus sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the strike, and countered with a swift slash of his blade across Koresh's exposed arm. The warlord snarled but kept coming, relentless. Blow after blow, Leonus deflected and dodged, his movements precise, his strikes aimed at every weak spot he could find: joints, wounds, exposed skin. He knew he couldn't match Koresh's brute strength in a head-on clash, but he could wear him down. Every cut, every hit, was part of a larger plan to outlast the warlord. "You fight like a desperate man," Koresh taunted, his voice thick with contempt. "But desperation won't save you." Leonus remained silent, letting his actions speak for him. He wasn't fighting out of desperation, he was fighting with purpose. Each attack was a calculated move, a step toward victory. He circled Koresh, his shield raised, waiting for the warlord to make another mistake. Koresh charged again, but this time, Leonus was ready. As the warlord brought his massive fist down, Leonus rolled to the side, coming up behind him. In one swift motion, he drove his blade deep into the back of Koresh's leg. The warlord let out a roar of pain, dropping to one knee. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock passing through them. Koresh, the undefeated champion, was on the ground, struggling to rise. But Leonus didn't celebrate. He couldn't afford to. Not yet. Koresh, wounded and bleeding, pushed himself back to his feet, his breathing ragged, but his eyes still full of fury. "You will not win!" Leonus stepped back, his mind racing. Koresh wasn't like the other opponents he'd faced. He wouldn't fall easily, even in the face of overwhelming damage. But there was something deeper driving Koresh now, something beyond pride or rage. Leonus could see it in the warlord's eyes, the fear of losing, the fear of his own legacy crumbling before the crowd. That was the warlord's weakness. Not his body, but his mind. "You're already losing," Leonus said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You just don't know it yet." Koresh roared and rushed forward again, but Leonus was already moving, slipping beneath the warlord's wild swings. He struck again, this time driving his spear into Koresh's shoulder, forcing the warlord to stumble backward. The crowd erupted, their cheers now a mix of disbelief and excitement. Koresh fell to one knee once more, his body heaving with each breath, his movements growing slower. Leonus stepped forward, standing over the fallen warlord. There was no malice in his gaze, only resolve. This was not about cruelty. It was about survival, about proving that humanity belonged in this arena, in this galaxy. "You fought well," Leonus said quietly. "But this is over." With a final strike, he drove his spear into the ground beside Koresh, a gesture of mercy. The warlord stared up at him, his expression a mix of shock and grudging respect. He had expected death, but Leonus had shown him something else: the power of restraint, the honor of a warrior who knew when the battle was truly won. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their voices shaking the arena as Leonus turned and walked away. The fight was over, but the message had been sent. He had not only survived, he had thrived, and in doing so, he had forced the galaxy to see humanity in a new light. As Leonus stepped through the arena's gates, the medic was there again, her eyes wide with awe and something else, something closer to hope. "You did it," she whispered, barely able to believe it herself. "You beat him." Leonus nodded, but there was no sense of triumph in his expression. "There will be more," he said quietly. "There's always more." She stepped closer, her voice softer now. But you've shown them something they can't forget. They'll never underestimate us again. Leonus didn't respond. The weight of the arena still hung over him, the knowledge that each fight brought him closer to the inevitable. But for now, he had earned his place. He had proven, not just to them, but to himself, that humanity could stand against the strongest the galaxy had to offer. As he walked down the corridor, the roar of the crowd fading behind him, Leonus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. This was just the beginning. The battles ahead would be harder, but so would he. And in the silence of the empty hall, he allowed himself one small, fleeting thought. Humanity had arrived. And they were here to stay.